Yes, I'm Peter Cook. I was born in a town called Southend-on-Sea, which is near to London. And as a child, I moved to many towns, all in England, because my dad was an army officer. And then I have lived in London for 50 or more years. I started my studies in an art school, which has an architect, a very tiny, a very old-fashioned architecture department. And then I came to the famous AA school. I've spent a lot of my career teaching, principally in three places. One is the Architectural Association, where I was a student. One is in the Städelschule, Frankfurt, which is also an art academy. And then at the Bartlett at UCL, which is the rival of the AA and up at the other end of the street, which is quite interesting. And now, of course, I'm retired from teaching, but I still do a lot of lectures and crits and stuff like that. But intermittently, I have been a building architect, as well as what I'm known for, I suppose, is a sort of teacher, theorist, drawing person, experimenting person, and so on. But I have actually produced about 7 or 8 buildings, some of which are known quite well. And interestingly, one of which was an architecture school, which was in Australia. It's very funny when you design something for which you understand the program. It makes it easier because it becomes an amalgam of anecdotes rather than just going by the rules. And at the moment, I'm still at the age of 88 producing things. There's something that will be constructed in London, a small building, but it will be quite prominently seen because I can't tell you what it is because it's just will be announced in 2 weeks' time, but it's happening. And then I'm designing some housing for Saudi Arabia. Whether that gets built in the end, we don't know, but I'm working on it. And I'm working on a small project in Los Angeles, also for a very small house, but in an interesting topographical condition. So it'll be a house plus a piece of sort of landscaping, if you like. And then, today we're working on a competition for Prague. I mean, it's and I have 3 books under commission, or 2 books under commission, one about to happen next week. So I have to now organize myself this next few weeks to at least spend a day a week writing, because I write very easily, but it takes time, And if a good publisher comes to you with an idea for a book, you don't say no, you say yes, and then the next day you wonder how the hell you're going to fit it in. But, as you see, I have a small office here, which is linked to another office, which gives us a few more people to be able to push at a larger project. And it's interesting to explain, if I have to explain, what am I? And I know that my accountant has sometimes been puzzled by what I am, because one year he says, what do we write to the tax man? You're a teacher, writer, okay. And the next year he says, well, you're a teacher. I say, no, I'm designing a big building at the moment. So we have to put that in. And then the next year he says, how's the building going? I said, well, that's finished. So now I'm writing another book. But then it gradually over time, it becomes the same activity. And for the last few years, with 1 or 2 different names and colleagues, I had been doing projects for buildings. The last building was finished about 2 years ago, and the next one is just about to start. Sometimes there's a long patch when there's not a lot happening. I've only once had the situation where there were two large buildings both going on at the same time, but that was a while back. And I try to surround myself with younger people. And for example, we have just revived the Archigram. The publisher of one of my books was very keen to dig me into starting it off again. And there are 40 people in this issue. And they're very mixed. They're mixed from people of my age right down to people in the, end of 20s. Mostly people around the middle of that range. And they're located all over the place, some in Los Angeles, some in Paris, some in London, some in Estonia, some in wherever. And the criterion for this particular issue is people that I think are interesting. It's a funny criterion. If you don't like it, you can blame me, because it's a very odd selection of people. Some of them probably don't like each other or don't know each other. And that intrigues me, that I think at the moment, the schools of architecture, particularly in the UK, are frightened. They don't want to suggest anything new. They don't want to suggest anything controversial. They want it to be politically fairly correct. And they don't put anybody much on the platform, whereas 10 years ago, there were all sorts of people circulating. Most of the people who are in the magazine would be out there giving lectures worldwide, but only one or two of them are, because nobody wants to hear anybody. And that doesn't just apply to old people, it's also new people, I think. You go on the internet and some names crop up and eventually they get a reputation, but to actually see them in the flesh, to see... There are biennales and there are exhibitions. In fact, almost exhibition openings are the only thing where you eyeball the people, and biennales, so that's a funny one. That is why I think we felt this year that to revive the Archigram was even more necessary, because these characters aren't getting circulation. Albeit that you could argue, what is the value of a printed page thing in the light of what you do, or what everybody else does, which is to stick stuff online. I think there's a little bit of a difference, like the idea of the publication as a trophy, as something you carry, that you put on your table, that somebody else sees it on the table, is a sort of exchange. It doesn't carry the same informational weight as it would have done 50 years ago because of the internet. The internet is carrying general information. But I think there's a particularity of... I was just given this morning a beautiful book of photographs. I met somebody in a party the other night. He's a fantastic photographer. He has the same name as me, curiously. It's also called Peter Cook. And he lives in English, but lives in Japan. And this book is it's a piece of art. It's a piece of elegance. His photography is extraordinary. I think it's really some of the very particular, very tectonic, very much to do with the structure of... I mean, he was trained as an architect. And it's extraordinary because I don't think certainly anything that would go on the internet or could be run off on an office printer, forget it. You can't do it. In the same way, rather, that you sometimes have to go to the cinema to see the movie in a sort of full experiential way. So I think that then raises the issue of the value of objects or of experiences or of eyeballing. I think still, if you go to see somebody talk, you see them in their relaxed moments and in their conscious moments. If you go to see a building in the real, you get a completely different vision of it because of the smell or of tactile quality of the material or because of how you see it relates to something off camera, as it were, you know. And I think for me, architecture is experiential. I think that I find that when I'm doing a project, I'm very much, I realize that it has relation to things that I've seen. That's not that I'm necessarily mimicking, but that things go into your system. Oh, and certainly I also forgot to say I do a lot of drawings that are separate from the projects. Sometimes, and there's one I'm just finishing at home now, which actually is related to the project I'm working on this week. That the project, which is specific, has given a impetus to a drawing which is to be seen as idealistic or abstracted. Not abstract, but abstracted. But everybody will get to see the link between the two. It will be very obvious. But generally, the drawings I do are trying to make a certain architectural statement. But because some people find them agreeable and they sell in galleries, people say, oh, you're an art person, you're a painter or whatever the hell, though they're rather architectural. So they, in recent years, they were something that almost crept up on me. You know, I've always had the odd drawing somebody bought in an exhibition, but lately, by making prints of them, they become more affordable and more able to be distributed. And that's an odd one, because now there are books being done about me, just about my drawings, which is slightly dangerous, because I really want to talk about the tectonics. And the publisher sometimes is interested just in them as pictures that look nice in a book, you know. But yes, so one's, you know, at my stage, I don't foresee my career path evolving that much different. It's more a question of trying to buy time to do more of the same, or more. When I say the same, yes, sure, I have certain ideas in my head that I've never managed to build. I think they could be built, and I try to work them into competitions or work them in, and hopefully suddenly you get the chance to do one of them, you know? And I do see that I have certain mannerisms, certain tricks or geometrical moves or color preferences or, well, mannerisms basically that find their way into the project. Occasionally, though, one's in a situation where you're having to use a different mannerism. For instance, in Saudi Arabia, where we are doing projects or competitions for projects and commissions to do these competitions, and they're always invited ones. They sometimes insist on something, for example, they call the Salmanic style, which is something that they have sort of invented in order to give a kind of commonality to the things that go up in that country. That is tricky, because I wasn't brought up with this sort of Salmanic style, nor do I necessarily rate it as being that significant. You know, but I know that in history there has been the use of mannerism in order to establish like physical architectonic mannerism, in order to establish a domain, in order to establish a sort of presence of the empire, you know, the Mughal architecture or the classical Greek architecture, or the fact that in maybe 100 and, I guess a bit more than 100 years ago now, 120 years ago, there were in Europe a number of of nationalist styles, which were loosely linked to Jugendstil or Nouveau, but were consciously attempting to be different one from the other, so that you would get a sort of Belgic, florid Art Nouveau. You would get in Norway this what they call dragon style, which is trying to look back at the Vikings. And somewhere else you go, there's, if you look at sort of the same period in say, Cairo or somewhere, it's another variant. They were all going through the same almost cultural politic notion of establishing a mannerism for the place. Only historically you can see that parts of their idea were running across from one country to the other, and you have to be pretty, sometimes expert to be able to say that this is Finnish Jugendstil, that is Swedish Jugendstil, that is Latvian Jugendstil. They are different, but there was something going on generally. And I think this Salmanic style related to the Salomon family is an attempt at that, but in a sense it is a sort of postmodernism and is affected by the sorts of things that motivated postmodern. But it's wanting to be its own thing. And it's all, in the way that you can walk up the street and say, yes, it's clearly English, but it's the English deliberately getting neoclassicism wrong, or playing with, not quite sure whether they're quoting classicism or they're quoting some kind of English rural style or something, And then suddenly you'll come upon a rather more major building, let's say, in the centre of London, which is out and out Italian at Renaissance, But if you had the money and you didn't care, you'd say, I want to do Italian Renaissance. We do Italian Renaissance. In the same way that now you might hire Frank Gehry to do a building. And you say, fuck you, we're going to do a Frank Gehry building. Whereas the locals will say, should we be as extreme as that? I mean, I'm interested in these things, and I suppose that comes from teaching and being old and observing a lot, and also being well, I call myself a creative cynic. I think I'm cynical, but I like a positive aspect of it. The reason for this Archigram is positive architecture, inventive to be positive, because there's so many people being negative. There's so many people saying, oh, we shouldn't do this, we shouldn't do that. We mustn't, we must be careful. It's all very boring, actually. Well, the context that I grew up in, of course, is I think there are certain influences from having lived in many places as a child. I had to adapt to, and I'm a townie, I'm not a countryside person. I lived in towns, not necessarily giant towns, not like London or anything, but towns of 100,000, 200,000, that kind of a size. Usually, and a couple of times somewhere smaller. I had to get to know a new town. I had to know how to get to school. I had to know where you could find the model aeroplane shop or the ice cream shop or something that is right. But I also had to be aware of places that were a bit dodgy to walk in, even then, when it was much safer for a child to walk about. But even then, you had this sort of perception, a certain part of the town you had arrived in was a bit, maybe don't hang around there too much. But another part was always very nice and bourgeois and relaxed. In Northern Europe, the wind comes from the west. The rich people live on the west hill above the river because the wind blows the smells across, and the poor people live in the east. That was and I found that this applies everywhere from Oslo down to Paris, down to Frankfurt, down to London. They all have the same pattern. The rich people live on the West Hill, and the poor people lived on the East. I mean, now it's all scrambled because, the smoke isn't there, but still a bit. And that was an easy one to pick up, and then that you go to a certain, and I'm just one of the books I'm doing. I use a drawing that I did called Sinister Street. And I'm talking about the idea of something being sinister, which is a very difficult one to deal with architecturally. It's even a difficult one to do pictorially. What makes the street sinister? It isn't just the juxtaposition of buildings or, the darkness of them. It may be some other factor. Somehow you sniff that somewhere's a bit odd. And I'm interested in that. And I've only ever done one drawing which was on that subject, but it was sort of experiment with myself. How could you? I don't know whether you could design in order to be sinister. I mean, you become a kind of film set person. But things like that interest me in the same way that some places are very artificial. Or very odd. I mean, for example, I take an example. I went, when I was once or twice in Valencia, there's work of Santiago Calatrava, it's his town. And you enter something that you've seen in a drawing or in a picture. And you sit in this thing, this big Santiago Calatrava. Now, to me, there's something odd about his stuff. It's as if it's very odd. I mean, I admire it geometrically, but I don't like it as a place. It's very abstracted. It's so, you see you're sitting on a piece of concrete or something, and it goes woof, up there. And it loses you. It's very strange, and it's a characteristic of his architecture. When you go in the airport at Bilbao, it's sort of, you can't, there's somebody at a desk, but you can't sort of touch it. I don't know what I mean by that. I don't know what I mean by that, but I know it. Whereas, let's say, again, to take Frank Gehry and in Bilbao, since I've mentioned it, which I know that building. I've been in it 3 or 4 times, and it is of a great scale, but you can touch it. I guess somehow it doesn't fall into that trap, and I don't know what this is, but it interests me. Now, conversely, I think particularly the English have a bad tendency to fuss. Their buildings are fussy. Their buildings are sometimes over-detailed, use too many materials. They can't leave it alone. They're the opposite of Calatrava. As you go into, might be a good or bad building, you go in and it's all too much. It's just as soon as some line or repetition or let's say some effect is established, they fiddle with it. They put another material on, another thing, and a decoy on here. English buildings tend to be too fussy. I'm talking about within my lifetime, stuff. And that's irritating too. Some people get it just right, and it's beautiful when they do. It's beautiful when they just know where to stop. That doesn't mean the buildings have to be boring. Maybe they've established something quite fantastic or heroic or intriguing, but they know where to stop. You don't want to be intrigued and intrigued and intrigued and intrigued and intrigued to come out. I think that it's always interesting to a building makes its statement, but not hundreds of statements. They just cancel each other out. One has to admit, I know that the Italians would lump us all together as architettura radicale. And then certain people in England would lump us together as part of the high-tech thing. And maybe, if you want broad labels, I was part of the radical architecture thing because the critics said so, and because one had certain links. I mean, I knew the Super Studio guys. Archizoom less, but Super Studio certainly were friends of mine. And through them, one or two of the other Italians. I was closer probably to the Austrians. Therefore, the whole stream of Austrians, from Hans Hollein, Walter Pichler, Karl Himmelbauer, I'm still friends with, Hausrucker a bit, and then some subsequent people, but more than in the Austrian thing, because I built there. I started to get more involved with the people who make buildings in Austria. So there's another, there's people, Raymond Abraham, of course, St. Florian, who's just died, I see, all friends of mine, and friends, combatants, co-teachers, whatever. We all circulated around each other a lot. And then, younger people, Volker Ginke and Klaus Kader and Helmut Richter, a whole lot of people, more than connected on the building as well as teaching scene. As I got involved in building also, then one admires another group of people who were still linked to those people, but a little bit less theoretical and a little bit more putting up really interesting buildings. So I've had a lot more exposure. I built 2 major buildings in Austria, so that's unusual. Japan also, a close affinity with Japan and many visits to Japan, and again, a stream of people, from Isazaki through Toyoito, Hasegawa, so on, through to Sana, all of whom have been friends of mine. Because we were somehow allies. And again, because it's the more recent people are more you associate with building than theory in a funny way. So I think so I would say that I'm not really in the same boat as Super Studio, because they were very theoretical, they were very rhetorical, they were very political. And I've been very unpolitical and relatively unrhetorical, I think. And the fashioning of buildings interests me just as much as the theory, in fact, rather more, I would say. And although I've been a very prominent and I suppose successful teacher, I've never been really a theory teacher. I've been somebody who talks about ideas and stuff. I'm very interested in the notion of stuff. I've several times given lectures about stuff, which is to almost exaggeratedly detach it from the whole thing of theory. In fact, I would even go further and say that I think theory has been very damaging to architectural teaching in the last 40 years. I think there are far too many people who call themselves theorists teaching in architecture schools and pretending to teach design, and they're not very interested in stuff. They're not very interested in buildings, really. The buildings are a vehicle for them to have theories. And I'm very suspicious of theories. I mean, I probably just in the last half hour stated various theories in a way, but they're related to stuff, like I've said, I think these attempts at nationalistic movements are always the product of the age and therefore distorted by the age. Now, whether that's a theoretical observation or just sort of just looking at stuff and realizing there's certain, I mean, I don't know what, it's observation, I think, rather than theory. I think you can use observation to inform, but I'm not sure whether you use theories to inform. So that would be my position on that. And you're going to talk to Kenneth Frampton, who will probably have a very, very different view, and he's very much more political than me. I was teaching in the Bartlett, I was the chair, but I also had a master's group, which by that time was probably about already 30 or 40 students, of which I think at least 9 were Chinese. And it happened to be the opening of the building. And I said, you must all come down for the opening. I thought it was a great idea. I took the whole group down there to the events of the opening. And then in a subsequent project, about 8 of the 9 Chinese put blue buildings with nozzles on. And I said, that's not why I took you there. I took you there because I wanted to celebrate with you. But you do not, that is not my style. I do not insist on, in fact, I really don't want you to do what I do. I've never been a teacher who wanted them to do what I do. I do have certain limits. Certain things I would expose my distaste for certain architecture. But I think I'm a fairly broad church of observation. You know, there's not a lot of architecture we'll totally dismiss. I would dismiss bad versions of architecture, but there's some things that are not remotely what I would do, but I'm interested in them. I think almost the hardest is the middle size. The small one you have to, you know, and I'm back to my criticism of the English scene. The small one you have to be very clear what it is and not to attempt to do too much. I remember there's an old saying that young architects always put every idea they ever had into their first house. Well, I've never had a house to do, so I don't know. And by now I know about that. And I think that, you know, probably the two buildings I like the most are the Graz and the little blue one, which is its sort of little baby tadpole. And probably the architecture school as well. I think they don't have too many ideas in them. You know, Graz is a fair-sized building, but basically it's a pin in the skin. Basically it's the thing of the hidden, within the bulb is the hidden building and the idea of the relaxed. I love the moment of getting away with putting in a travelator, which is a commonplace thing you get in railway stations. It's not a sort of high art, you know, and I actually always quote a quotation that at the opening day, the Chancellor of Austria came to open it. And I went up the travelator with him, talking to him. And we both had a glass of white wine in our hand, and we were just gliding up what would have been a sort of arch ceremonial moment. You could be 2 guys going to catch the number 3 train. I think it became consciously inspired by the digital. And, you know, after all, Hernan is a digital guy, and a lot of his key teachers are digital guys. I think it, as we say, espoused digitalism and took it to its breast, you know, and has its own sort of take on digitalism. I mean, I've seen things at certain times. I haven't been there for a year or so, but over the years, I've seen certain things that saw for the first time, and sometimes they were crazy. Like I referred to one period, maybe, you know, whatever it was, beginning lockdown period or thereabouts. I called it the decorated hedgehog architecture. I mean, you go to SCI-Arc and you have to brace yourself for what might the hell come up. And then if you spend a sort of half a day getting into the thing, and then the rest of the time you're on it, you have to, first 2 or 3 hours, you have to get back into the SCI-Arc world. During lockdown, I remember I was on juries at SCI-Arc, sitting in my home in the bay window with the laptop and critting stuff. And that was funny because, you know, you really need to be there to experience it. And then they opened up again after that, you know, it was sort of limited. And my wife and I were back on juries in SCI-Arc, and it was quite different because there's stuff and people and the real person is there, and they dress up in a suit or something, or they do whatever they do. I love SCI-Arc. I'm a big fan of SCI-Arc. I just hope that the next head of SCI-Arc is also a designer. What is very interesting about SCI-Arc, if you take the history of SCI-Arc, all the directors of SCI-Arc have been designers. Now, Ray Capet to, you know, Neil Denari, Eric Moss, Michael Rotundi, Hernan Diaz Alonso, they're all designers, each of their own way. And what was interesting, for example, if you take the period when Eric Moss was head. Now, I know that a lot of the people teaching in SCI-Arc really don't like his work, but he was a very good director. Somehow he let them coexist. He was a very astute director, though he looked as if he was fairly laid back, but actually he was an excellent director. Interesting place, and no other school has had consistently designers. Now, I hope it doesn't drop the ball now. Well, no, I can't even use a computer. I'm sitting on the laptop most of the day, and I can put together lectures, books, minimum graphics, but immediately it goes to somebody sitting next to me, you know, to be developed. I mean, the thing that I've been working on now, this small thing that's about to be built, I did the first 2 or 3 weeks of drawings until we established which version of, there were several possible versions. And for various cost reasons, technical reasons, we opted for one. And as soon as it starts getting really intricate, it's out of my hands. It's on the computer. There's somebody working on it now, on the interior part of it, the lady in the corner. And I can't draw what she's drawing now. I've given her all the rules, and I do colored pencil drawings, and even I do some drawings to scale. But there's a certain point at which her computer takes over and manipulates it and presents me with views of it that I can't even draw. And now it's getting to the constructor, and they produce more computer drawings that I can't even draw. And now I'm in the position of an editor. I've withdrawn from the... There are people of my age who have taken to the computer. I have been lazy, if you like. I've stayed in my comfort zone because I do drawings and things. And that's interesting because I'm old school. I like to make rough models. I like to make a model of a piece of it, just to tell you what it's trying to do. And once you know it's working, you almost abandon the model. Yeah. I mean, the history of me is many abandoned models. You do this piece and then you know it works. Okay, let's move on. Or you do that to have a complete model. My worry about the computer-produced model is that it tends to want the complete thing. And my worry, it's okay, I suppose, if you made endless ones, if you just kept making. But I remember often I've been to Frank Gehry's office, and you see all these half-made models and I know how he works because he's taken us around and shows how he works. and he pins things on and takes them off and kicks them. And I'd done that in the past. There's a little blue metal building there. I designed that almost with no proper drawings. I mean, it went to a colleague on the computer, and she produced all the drawings. But I did it with a big balsa wood model, about so big, with that, more or less that form. And I moved things. I did a Frank Gehry. I pulled bits off and pinned them on and glued them on again, and then moved it up and then took it off and put it on and took it off and put it on. And then had discussions with the engineer. And then the lady who was working on it then has it up for the next year or so on the, it develops. But there wasn't a lot of conventional drawing, but the thinking was done on the model. Actually, the thinking was done on the model. Does that work right? Does that look right? Does that need to be more? Does that need to be less? We were getting to 45 people, and already it was getting hierarchical and funny, and it's still a bit complicated, but I think the ideal number of people is 15. When we did this building, which is the Vienna one, the coloured one, which is very large, before we won the competition, we were about 4 people. And we suddenly won this thing, and we had to go to 30 people, which by my standards is a lot of people. It wasn't the most enjoyable. And then we scaled down and overlapped with the Australian building. We had about 15 people around the time of the Australian building. That was perfect. We're too small now. And then we have a resource of about another 7 people that we can, but they're not sitting here, they're sitting in Belgrade. That's not ideal. I don't know, because we do a lot of stuff sitting in here looking at that screen and mirror boards and all sorts of stuff. But it's not the same as somebody next to you. You say, why don't we try this? I think you're right. And actually, Branko, my friend, who's just flown out, we had lunch just before you came. And we were talking about this very thing, about the number of people that is good to work with. You need more than what I've got right now, and I have to even hire in part-time, 1 or 2 part-time guys, because it's not quite enough to do it. But I would have thought 10 people is good, 8 people, probably 8 people you can get by, do quite a lot, 8 to 15. Oh, and we were talking about that as well, because he's just come back from Vietnam, and he says in Vietnam it's really amazing what you can get away with. And in Europe, the regulations are enormous. I mean, the amount we have on health and safety and wind loading. Now everybody's getting worried about the climate, so that I was proposing this pavilion thing originally as an inflatable, and they got very worried. They said, no, an inflatable will have such a lot of trouble, and the winds are getting stronger and stronger. So I came up with back to a geodesic dome, because it was stable. And even that, they're making so many calculations. And, it's as if the thing is, it's a temporary building, but as if it's going to sit there for 100 years, it doesn't blow over and doesn't sink and doesn't this and doesn't that. And so the number of consultants, enormous. Even on competitions, sometimes you have to show, for the Saudi stuff even, that we have to buy in all sorts of consultants. They demand that you have them and show who they are, and they have to help present. It's ridiculous, I mean, on these things, in Vienna, there was a big organization that built all of the group of buildings. big engineering company. They weren't very good, actually, but nonetheless, they were big. In Graz, there was another office, actually it's the local mafia who took most of the money, who was supposed to be helpful. We still had to hire the main guys. What else? In Australia, theoretically, we had Arabs support, but they were a crappy branch of Arabs. We still did most of it ourselves. You know, sometimes, I don't know, no, because we were having this conversation. It's mostly the admin stuff that you need. You probably need to have, you know, one or two people simply writing memos and filling in forms and stuff, you know, to get it off your back. But it does slow things down. Even a competition where it says, have you done this? If you've done this, you tick the box. If you haven't done it, you don't tick the box. And sometimes we have to almost lie and cheat in order to get allowed to be participating. Most of the time when I was teaching, I would suggest a topic, sure, of course. I would not be too prescriptive about how you interpret it. I didn't always, occasionally I did, but I didn't always give a detailed specification, like, you know, the dining hall should be 300 square meters kind of thing, you know, 16 cupboards and whatever. I just said, you know, the problem is fishing. Or the problem is, yeah, it might be housing occasionally, but usually the problem is, you know, what to do with this area. But not just what to do with it as a sort of few diagrams, but what do something whereby you could be living in this area. Therefore, you have to show me, you have to do it in some sort of housing or equivalent of housing, or it can be a bubble, or it can be but the problem is living. Or if you come in and say, you know, we don't have any houses, but we're going to have a series of microwave crucibles, that's fine. That answers the problem. Or if you say, no, we're going to do 15-floor high blocks, that equally answers the problem. I'm interested in what you do with the issue. But yeah, I usually places that are familiar. I mean, I did one winter about 6 years ago at Harvard. I did a Harvard winter thing. And I brought my Harvard students here and I gave them a site across the street from my office, but it was a very open-ended brief. I said, we want somewhere that is some kind of meeting place for architects and design people, people of that ilk. And I said, here's the site. And the site was there. They could measure it, they could see it. So I said, I don't mind how you interpret that. It's some sort of place that people will meet. You can decide exactly what they do when they meet, whether it's some sort of atelier, or whether it's simply a meeting place, or whether it's a place where you go and stay. But that is the overall purpose of it, and that is the precise site. So you have two givens, but a lot of push-pull. That interests me then, because I was interested in how they reacted to the issue, but also wanted to know how they precisely reacted to the site. I didn't want them sort of saying, well, I know we don't want anybody to meet here, we're going to do something in France. No, I wanted them to attack that site because it interested me as a site, a slightly ambiguous site, and they responded well because they're bright students, you know. I think it's important to have a strong lead. I think it's important, dare I say, to have a personality as a lead who has a sense of inspiration to the whole place. But I think it's also important that that person is interested enough in other positions to have some maybe contradictory people. And I think it's important for the person who leads the school to understand people, which many of them don't. And I think, but it's now a minority view, I guess, I think it's important for the leader of the school to be a designer, or to at least gone through the process of being a designer. They might not be a very good designer, but they know what the process of designing is. I think it's always very interesting to compare the line of criticism or writing of somebody who came from art history or theory and somebody came through the design process. Because there are things that the design that you do as a designer which I think other people don't understand, why you might link certain dots, you know? The criteria by which you do certain things when you're designing a building is, some of it's folkloric, some of it is sort of common sense, you know? And common sense is something that doesn't appeal to critics very much. You know, they're not interested in common sense. A lot of architecture is good architects, common sense. And then a few really neat overviews, but how else does stuff move on? Where else, if not in the schools? I mean, I think what is in danger of happening is that the real progress will now be made in a few offices in a curious way. Now that sounds like a contradiction, but I think there are a few offices where, by the nature of the person leading the office, by the nature of the research that they're doing, architecture can move on, but not in the way that it would if there were good schools. So, for example, the Foster office has some amazing research going on. You know, it has the ability to do technical research way beyond probably almost anybody else, because they have that big, they're giant and powerful and rich and so on. That doesn't mean the theory of their buildings moves on, or the mannerism, but it may. But there's still stuff moving forward that other architects can look and say, that's how we might do it. That material we might use, that technology we might use. Maybe they will use it in a more primitive way, but it will push forward. Now, I don't think architecture should just move by that motion, but I think there's more interesting work going on in some offices and laboratories and so on than there is in the schools. But I might be wrong. There might be somewhere. You know, maybe it's happening in Peru. Who knows? Well, it's very funny. There was somebody somewhere, I can't remember who it was or what context, but somebody wrote in some magazine or something that his PC music was the Archigram of music or something. And then somebody wrote back to him, maybe it was online, but and said, don't you realize he's actually the son of? And the person who wrote the first bit didn't know that. It was just, they used it as a sort of referencing. And then I was giving a lecture in SCI-Arc at the beginning of last year, and my son was in the audience, and then somebody asked a question about, you know, what was this connection and so on. And I said, well, I'm loath to exactly. I said, Alexander, are you in the room? And he said, yes, from the back. And when I finished, the kids at the back were more interested. They rushed to see him, not me. Well, you know, it was interesting because my wife was an architect also, so he was a kid of two architects, one well-known. And he kept asking us as he was growing up, are you sure you don't want me to be an architect? And we said, no, 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 because my wife her family had led her to studying chemistry, which she did. Only when she qualified did she switch to architecture. On the other hand, I had the opposite, which I went straight in at the age of 16. But so we were both very clear to him. We didn't mind what he did. And he even went to a school where there were several children of architects. But never mind. And he met, my standard quotation is, because it actually happened, that where he had breakfast with Frank Gehry and supper with Zaha, I say, a kid that grows up with this, he stands no chance. And he knows a lot of architects. He knows quite a lot about architecture. He knows Frank Gehry, actually, and he has had breakfast with him, and he's been to his, and other architects, and sons and daughters of architects. But he was a very short period when he thought he might be a furniture designer. So we bought him a book about it. He said, these are all architects, all these guys. And he does draw. He likes drawing, and he's quite into graphics, but not excessively, but quite a lot, more than the average kid is into graphics. And therefore, when he has his sort of graphic support, he's quite fussy, has very certain people, and he's quite engaged with that aspect of it, more than maybe other people would be. Yeah, he went to a school which has a lot of kids of creative people, including architects. And two of his friends that he still does work with are people he was actually at school with. Okay. Even though he's mostly in America, but they go there as well. And they still have, and both of their fathers were composers, but they already were halfway in the business. There's a lot of this. I think there's a sort of attitude towards creativity that certain people have, I think. And that does transcend whether you are actually a carpenter or actually a urbanist or